All right, so move into this sort of first substantive chapter in Borg's book. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have acquired the book? Can't see the hands up. That's okay.
A little raise hand button.
That's all right. That's all right. Just curious.
Okay.
It doesn't really make any difference. What I thought I would do, rather than give a full summary of the chapter and then do the discussion questions, the questions were sort of broken out by section. And so I thought what we would do is we do the section and then talk about the question. And if there was not a lot of conversation about that particular question, then we just easily move on. I'll keep track of time so that we don't run out of time before we've hit the end of the chapter, because I think that last piece is really important. So Borg starts out really in this section pointing out again that the Gospels are not straightforward historical documents. And what he points out is that early Christians adapted the traditions about Jesus to new circumstances and then continued to experience Jesus as a living reality after his death. So there's the memory and then the current experience. And he says that these sort of translate out into two layers of material in the Gospels, two voices. And there's the voice of the pre-Easter Jesus, and then there's the voice of the community in the post-Easter setting. Those two voices. And if we want to get to Jesus, we have to separate the two. So sort of the first question that he raises is, are you comfortable with this separation of two voices? Does that make sense? Are there questions around that?
Well, how does your faith grow if you just stay in one place? I don't call it pre-Easter and post-Easter. I call it pre-8th grade Jesus and post-8th grade Jesus. And when you get after 8th grade, it starts to, all these little nuances kind of come at you. As a matter of fact, when you showed the Jesus on the screen,
yeah,
he was too light. He was probably 3 shades darker than that. They were from a Bedouin tribe that would spend 6 months of the year in the desert and then come back. And so you really see him, think of him 3 shades darker. So can you imagine a Jesus showing up at your front door, dressed in this tunic, going, "Hi, peace be with you." And I'd go, "Well, is there a Hare Krishna group in the neighborhood somewhere, or what's going on?"
That's when you'd need that angel saying, "Don't be afraid."
That's right.
TSA profile him as a terrorist.
Oh yeah.
Like just going back to the question here, does it make sense to talk about these two voices, this sort of pre-Easter Jesus, but also the voices of the community sort of reflected back on him? Does it make sense to draw that distinction?
I like it.
Okay.
I get that sense every day with devotions because I use the lectionary. I absolutely love the lectionary. So I like it.
I like the separation because it sort of ties, to some extent, the Old Testament and the New Testament together. The two have very different tones or feels to them. The Old Testament is much more punitive and darker. The New Testament is much more uplifting and forward-looking. And the voice of the community, which came from the Old Testament, looking at the New Testament, it kind of makes that distinction of where they really were in that, and how much different what a change this represented to them.
Carla, it looked like you wanted to say
Yeah,
something.
I did. I think I don't understand. Yeah, I read the chapter, but because of the end of the chapter was so startling, the separate. So I'm not sure about the two voices, but looking solely at the historical,
Post-Easter.
the belief,
Okay.
John's Gospel, Jesus, I could hardly sleep.
Oh, dear. Okay.
I'm not sure where the two voices, to separate the believer's Jesus and the historical Jesus was a little confounding to me.
Okay. So that, okay.
I have the book, and I didn't have a chance to read it this week, although I have read it in the past. But I think one of the things that I find helpful with the separation of the two voices is it helps explain some of the apparent contradictions, I think.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in just a second. I mean, some places where you have two clearly two alternative voices. So let's move along here. So he then moves into this sort of discussion about the fact that Jesus was a Jew, and he claims, he points out, so that Jesus was deeply Jewish. He saw his mission within Judaism, and asserts that any faithful image of Jesus must take with utmost seriousness his rootedness in Judaism. And then he goes on to say, because he was, of course, embedded in Judaism, Borg feels it's important to point out that Jesus's opponents were not the Jews, but a small elite who had power sort of given to them by the Romans. Not so much the Jews in general, but a particular subset of Jews, especially powerful Jews in that case. And so the question of that is, had you thought much about the Jewishness of Jesus? And does that add to, detract? It doesn't make much difference to how you think of Jesus.
I think a great deal about it. And last night I saw Nina Totenberg share with the audience a Jewish saying about Rosh Hashanah and those who die as Rosh Hashanah begins. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg evidently died at that transition. And it's lovely. It's simply lovely. God waits to take those until Rosh Hashanah, who had more work to do on this earth. And I love that. I have no problem with it. So I see us as an offshoot of Judaism. And I see Islam the same way.
Okay. Your comment reminds me of something that I learned in seminary, and this kind of gets to your point a little bit, Carla, that the person who taught me Greek, New Testament professor in seminary, came in the first day of class, and he said, "I'm going to teach you the only words that we can be sure that Jesus said." And that was Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Blessed are you, Lord God, creator of the universe, who brought forth bread from the earth, the blessing over the bread. He said, that's the only thing that we can be sure that Jesus said. And so that sort of set the context for a lot of what we did, and it sort of stands behind, and that was a long time before Borg wrote, but it was very similar in some respects about what do we really know. But it was because that was the Jewish prayer over the bread, we can be assured that he said it.
So I've always taken the Jewishness of Jesus to a great height, as a great weight. When I was in Canada, I had a middle school Sunday school group that was a Sunday school group from hell. And I threw out a great deal and said, I'll teach these little buggers, but only if I can do it my way. So we walked through the bits and pieces of the prayer book and then went on field trips. And at this point, I think we were studying light and comparing Christmas and Hanukkah and Diwali maybe. Anyway, we were at a Jewish synagogue, and they put us in the chapel while we were waiting for the rabbi. He was busy doing something. So the kids were flipping through the prayer books, which of course were backwards. That was already interesting. And but they found the English section, and it started out with that prayer in English, "Hear, O Israel." And one of the kids looked at me and said, "But they stole our prayer." And I had to kind of say, well, actually, is at that point the rite we were using started with that prayer. Everything about Jesus has to be seen through the lens of Jewishness. I think that's what made it so special when Bonnie Spencer was with us at Good Shepherd, because she brought Jewish lenses that we were unaware of. And when she preached, I could hear more of Jesus's Jewishness through her Jewishness. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's what bugged me the most about Swedish Jesus was Swedish Jesus that I grew up with as a child, blonde hair, blue eyes, and not one bit of Jewishness, was not the Jesus that I met in Scripture. So I think it's really important.
I remember in one of my churches that I think I was an assistant, and there was an elderly lady, and one day she just sort of grasped me by the shoulders and said, "Is Jesus Jewish?"
Yes.
Yes.
I can't believe that people wouldn't know that Jesus is. I mean, do this, the whole line of David. Now, of course, maybe that's not true either, but I mean, it's all about the line of David and the Messiah. And of course, we didn't know he was Messiah during the Gospels, but.
Well, in the readings, when Bork talks about convincing one of his students that Jesus was Jewish, she replies, but his mother wasn't.
Yes, she was. She was the line to David.
Carla,
So he kind of convinced her, but she still wanted the Blessed Virgin to be Swedish or
something.
or whatever.
I've had Sunday school teachers tell children that Daniel in the lion's den was saved because he was a good Christian. So
Oh no!
There's a lot of ignorance out there about who was what.
I have got to say, folks who come from the particularly evangelical or Southern, particularly Southern Baptist or Southern Reformed type tradition, just don't get this. They're never presented with this point of view at all. It's very much, it comes across once in a while in the scriptures, but it's just kind of glossed over and downplayed because it's not relevant to what is important.
Yeah.
And standing behind that is a kind of the dominance of white Christians. It is part of the sort of caste system, and unwillingness to see Jesus as Jewish conflicts with sort of basic clan values. So that's what you're really dealing with, I think.
Well, just as we find the darker faced Jesus interesting, look at this picture of Mary.
Oh yeah, very Anglo-Saxon.
Mary.
Yeah, so let's move along because this is a big chapter and want to sort of get through it. So
let's go on.
You were talking about Mary, and which is, here we shifted to this slide. So, and most scholars, these stories of Jesus's birth, most scholars agree that there's no historical basis for these stories, of any of the stories about Jesus's birth and childhood. And Borg, you know, he's not saying anything that's surprising. He says that it only shows up in Matthew and Luke, that were written at the end of the first century. Mark, written 10 years earlier than they were, doesn't mention anything about Jesus's birth. Paul mentions absolutely nothing about Jesus's birth or early childhood, and nor does John. So it's only Matthew and Luke that talk about this. So given the sort of paucity of witnesses, there's this argument that it's a problem. Also, he points out that there's a lot of difference between Matthew's story and Luke's story. The genealogies go in different directions. Where the birth happens is different. Was there a star? Well, in one gospel there is, but not in the other. Who are the witnesses? Wise men or shepherds? And of course, Matthew's got this story of the slaughter of the innocents that Luke doesn't. All of these are pretty significant, and each one by themselves, each event, like the slaughter of the innocents or the they're significant, but they aren't shared. And so what Borg would argue is that these stories represent themes that are important to each evangelist. Matthew emphasizes Jesus's kingship, so the wise men come seeking the king of the Jews. Luke emphasizes Jesus as a radical social prophet, and we've got marginalized shepherds that are there at the birth, not wise men. So these, and he also points out, because it makes sense in a lot of other places, that these stories use primal religious imagery. So the issue of light into darkness, for example, or how a miraculous event around a significant personage, whether that person turns out to be a deity or just like a Caesar or something like that. There's usually something quite miraculous around that. But what he does point out is, and I think that this is always helpful to keep in mind, that the birth stories tell us that Jesus, and this is a quote from Borg, was such an extraordinary person that these kinds of stories were told about him. But how? And then he asks, how did it happen that such stories were told about a marginalized Jew from Galilee? So the point being that Jesus was so amazing that they had to make up stories about his birth. They just sort of had to do it that way. So
isn't it true that they told similar stories about Caesar's?
Caesar's,
birth and stars and all that kind of stuff.
Yep. Hercules.
Well, and many of the gods in pagan traditions were virgin birth.
Yeah, so it wasn't, I think to folks in the sort of more modern world, that's an astonishing thing, and we're going to argue over how this could have happened. But in the ancient world, it was part of discussion around figures of significance, and it wasn't so surprising.
Romulus was a virgin birth.
It's kind of their tall tales.
Wasn't it also linked to Old Testament prophecies, so that in order to be the fulfillment of the prophecy, you had to weave a story that hit as many high points as you could?
Well, sure, and Matthew does that pretty much throughout. You'll say this was to happen. This happened to fulfill the prophecy by the prophet so and so. So he uses this a lot more than some of the others. The other gospel writers do this sort of playing on the prophetic. Any kind of
or he makes it more explicit, at least.
But then he was writing for Jewish people who would know the Jewish scriptures.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So he's situating Jesus in a context that makes sense. So how just open question, how do you all view the birth stories? I mean, are they telling, what is the truth, if any, that they are telling for you?
Well, I learned in Latin in high school that December the 25th was a celebration of Saturnalia, and it was a huge Roman holiday. So why not adapt it for the day of Jesus's birth? You know, it was adaptability. When we get into the second part of the context, could Jesus have been born in a stable? You know, yeah, that's possible, because I think the census was happening. I think that was an accurate piece. It was going on, but they came down to Jerusalem for the census, and you know, babies have been born in the fields of Weld County, Colorado, for a long time, and probably aren't right now because it's hard to get workers. But that's not an unusual situation. So I don't have problems with the idea of it was a birth of a, you know, poor couple or a couple that couldn't find housing. And I think some of us have been in that situation on cold wintry nights. And then they had visitors, but you know, that doesn't bother me. And
What about some of the
I
rest
like
of
the
the folk?
story. I'm sorry, what?
I said, what about some of the rest of the folk?
Yeah.
What comes to my mind, Carla here.
Yeah.
What comes to my mind is, so what do I tell my grandkids? You know, do we approach these stories as stories, or are they going to grow up first thinking everything's true? So that was what came to my mind about it.
Well, I think it gets kind of to what Mike was saying very early on, is that there's an understanding of one sort up to a certain point, and then that understanding can change. And you know, the question that I asked at the beginning is, what is the truth that you get out of these stories? You know, is it the literal truth of the story, or is there a different kind of truth that is being told through the story? And so, you know, that's something that each of us will sort of have to decide on our own. Some people have said that the important thing about these birth stories is not that, for example, is not that Mary was a virgin, but that God was the father. You know, the issue is linking Jesus to God, not a virgin birth. So, you know, there are different ways of approaching these, and each of us will take them in our own particular direction.
I think the approach about, you know, these stories are for those communities that were coming into being, and they had significant questions about Jesus, and these stories began to answer them.
Yeah.
How could there be such a person? Well, you know, I can fix that. I can write a story.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's some correlations between you know, indigenous religions and their tales, their stories. They're based on truth but not fact.
Oh,
and
Very true.
if we can split truth from fact, what is, as you said, what is the truth here? The truth is, this was a babe who was so amazingly different, unique, that a boring old birth story wasn't going to be good enough. You know, I mean, it kind of reminds me of the North American tall tales of Paul Bunyan and
Yes.
what was the steel driving man's name? I've forgotten.
John
John
Henry.
Henry. John Henry.
Probably based
Paul
in
Bunyan.
probably was larger than life. But you know, the fish I caught that was this big, I swear to God it was this big. But I really did catch a big fish, you know. But why is it important to make, you know, in 50 years, will RBG be way bigger than she is? She's already really big in a very small body, you know. Why do we
Good example. Good example.
like that and make them larger than life? Because there's something about them that is, and it's beyond this physical plane. But our brains and our language don't do that well.
So right now, I mean,
Oh.
I'm going to try and move us forward here, just mindful of time. You know, we don't know. We have what Matthew and Luke told us going forward about those birth stories, and we know that Mark and John didn't say anything about them, nor did Paul. Other stories and traditions grew up much later about how Jesus grew up. The only one of his story about his youth that we have is him at 12 years old in the temple. You know, that's the only thing that we know, or the only story we have between his birth and his sort of following after John the Baptist. But Borg says, you know, there are some things that we probably can know, and that he was born at the end of the reign of Herod the Great, so before 4 BC. That's always funny that Jesus Christ was born in 4 years before Christ. It's kind of funny. His parents were Jewish, Mary and Joseph. He had 4 brothers and several sisters. Joseph apparently died before Jesus started his public ministry. He's never mentioned after Jesus is other than, well, we know who his dad was, people saying that. He grew up in Nazareth, pretty clear, the evidence is that, which was a small town, but only 4 miles from a large town that is never mentioned in the Gospels, a large city known as Sepphoris. Only 4 miles from there, that had a population of 40,000 at that point. So it was a pretty cosmopolitan place. It was not necessarily a rural backwater. There were a lot of Gentiles and a lot of Greek spoken, Borg points out. He probably grew up to be a woodworker. The word that's described, he's described as a tekton. So it doesn't necessarily mean he built houses, but he may have built wooden frames for windows and things like that. But the lower end of the peasant class. He didn't have land. And so, you know, not a particularly high status person. Probably growing up in a Jewish household, in a Jewish town. He participated in the practices of common Judaism, festivals and prayers and things like that, and probably did some study at the synagogue there in Nazareth. But at some point, he became a religious seeker. Something within him said, I'm looking for more. And so we don't know what that is, but he became a follower of John the Baptist. That's pretty much what all the evidence points to in terms of how he grew up into his early adulthood. Does that make sense? Is there something dramatically odd or missing from that presentation? Hearing none.
Unknown about his early days.
Say that again, Nan?
There's so much unknown about his early days.
Right.
You know, I've often wanted to imagine what he was like as a child.
Right.
And that was my blasphemy in Baptist Sunday school.
Yep.
Well, he played tricks on other kids, and did he ever disobey his parents? And no, this was always the perfect child.
Right.
Yeah.
Never cried.
Yeah.
Never, you know, was he born potty trained? You know, who knows? You know, all these things about his early days that we think of as being common to raising a child are just missing.
Yep. So I want to, again, thinking of time here, I'm going to kind of push through some of the rest of some of this stuff without stopping. If you want me to stop me. But he starts this piece about what we really, what we're really most interested in is the adult Jesus. And he points out that what he is doing has a history, what Borg is doing has a history in scholarship, biblical scholarship, that stretches back a ways. Albert Schweitzer, of all sorts of fame, I knew Schweitzer partly because he was a he was a great organist and did editions of Bach's organ works.
Yeah.
Others know him as this medical phenomenon in Africa. I mean, but he was also an interesting biblical scholar, and he wrote a book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus. And so this idea of trying to get back behind the text to who was Jesus goes back. And Borg says, he makes these two negative claims. He points out that Jesus probably was non-messianic. He in his own self-understanding. And I chose this picture just because Jesus pointed away from himself to God. He wasn't pointing at himself. He was pointing to God, according to this way of doing the analysis. And that he probably, Borg claims, probably was not eschatological. That is, he did not expect a supernatural coming of the kingdom of God as a world-ending event in his own generation. That idea that Jesus was an eschatological prophet has had wide play in the middle to the end of, through the latter decades of the 20th century. There's been some movement away from that, and Borg reflects that. So he says Jesus didn't point to himself, and he wasn't looking towards the end of the world, as many have claimed. What he does say is based on his study of sort of religious typologies, or typologies of religious figures. And so he calls these the 4 positive strokes. And these are what we'll really end up discussing over the next 4 or 5 weeks. So based on this typology of religious figures, he says what we can know about Jesus is that he was a spirit person. And we'll talk about that. That's much of what's left in this chapter. He was a teacher of wisdom. And this icon is the classic icon of Jesus as teacher. That he was a social prophet, and that he was a movement founder. So all of these are typologies of various religious figures. They don't all show up in the same person, but they often do. And so you can think about other religious leaders. You can think about how Muhammad might have fit all 4 of those categories, or the Buddha might have fit all of those categories. So he argues that if we see Jesus in these categories, it gives us a different set of lenses through which to look. So do these negative views or these positive views, do they make sense? Or are they problematic?
Well, I think the beauty of them is they ask you to reflect on your faith. You know, when you get done reading Borg, you always say, well, now what? What am I supposed to do now? Because my faith was here, and you've asked me to go here. And so what it gives you is that introspective of, do you want to grow your faith, or do you just want to stay where you're at? Are you the leave it to beaver Christian, or are you the uncomfortable Christian that wants to grow? And I think Borg asks you that every time you read him. You kind of go, well, now I got to think about this in a different perspective.
Okay. Anyone else?
I think it makes a lot of sense. If you think of God as always wanting to be in relationship with people, and the Old Testament is a chronicle of the many, many times that God tried to be in relationship with God's people. And so Jesus was like, okay, I will even send my son to try to build this relationship. And if Jesus' purpose is to show us how to be on earth, not how to be God on earth, but how to be in relationship with God on earth, then I think this makes perfect sense as a description of Jesus' understanding of himself and his role and his purpose.
Thanks.
I found the hardest thing to think about was that Jesus and, say, shamanism had a link.
Ah.
You know,
Okay.
I don't. Anyway, it was an interesting. I think it's right, but I need to work on it.
Okay.
Well, Mary, to just extend on that, at least what I know about Muslim faith is that they would agree with all four of those points. In a way, Borg is crossing the aisle between secular images of Jesus and the religious images of Jesus. Each of those 4 points have historical reference, and they have reference in the Quran. So I think you're onto something there, Mary. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Good. So Borg goes on to say, you know, this is the other thing that we probably can really know about Jesus. You're cutting in and out, Diane. It's hard to hear what you're saying. Looks
Never
like she's
mind. Go ahead.
okay. Sorry. He says the other things that we can know about Jesus, just from everything, all of the evidence seems to be pretty consistent, is that his verbal gifts were remarkable. He could tell great stories. There were dramatic public actions. The cleansing of the temple is pretty darn dramatic.
Oh, yes.
You know,
Oh, my goodness, yes.
that there was a radical social and political edge to his message, pretty clearly. He was a remarkable healer, not alone in that, and that he was young. You know, if the dating is correct, you know, all of this was done in his early 30s, and which doesn't reflect any of us on this Zoom screen right now. So you know,
life expectancy wasn't 85 either.
No, that's true. That's true. But still, he was a young guy. So here he goes into this this first category in terms of the typology, that Jesus was a spirit person or a mediator of the sacred, and he says that Jesus was one of those people in human history to whom the spirit was an experiential reality. That it was so central to who he was that he sort of lived and breathed the spirit, which is not, I think, certainly it wouldn't be something that I could describe as myself. And spirit persons, this gets at what Mary was saying, you know, known cross-culturally. People who have vivid and frequent subjective experiences of another level or dimension of reality. I am not that. I am so grounded in this reality that sometimes it's a little odd when I run into folks like this, but I have. Meeting the Dalai Lama, for example, is like walking into a different world. Just the space is recreated by his presence. They have a strong sense of there being more to reality than the tangible world. And the word, the sacred, is what refers to that other reality. And religions name that in different ways. God is one of those ways, Allah, or one of those ways of naming this sacred quality. And so spirit persons mediate that sacred by speech, by healing, their charismatic leadership. And so he says, you know, Jesus used specific spiritual practices in maintaining that connection, fasting and his long periods of prayer. I don't think that what the Gospels mean when they say Jesus went to the mountain pray is that he went to the mountain and pulled up his prayer book and went to page 52 and did morning prayer. I think that the experience that Jesus had with God was quite different from that. Borg also points out that Jesus addressed God on very intimate terms, Abba, Father, calling him Daddy, that this relationship is really quite different than the way that most of us, I think, interact with God. And in terms of this being a mediator of the sacred, Jesus spoke with authority, flowing out of his own spiritual experience. And you see that reflected in many of the stories in the Gospels that, you know, oh, what is this, a new teaching? He's not teaching like the scribes, but as someone with authority, that it's coming out of him. It's not just a reflection of some other text. And then he points, Borg points out that Jesus' spirituality can be located in the Jewish mysticism of the day. So he wasn't entirely outside of what other Jews might have been doing, but certainly he was remarkable for the way that he was able to do it. And he concludes this section by saying, at the center of Jesus's life was a profound and continuous relationship with the Spirit of God. So Jesus and Jesus' relationship with God, however you want to define it, was something that was extraordinary for Jesus, but also for all of those folks who were around him. So, what do you think? Does this image speak to you? It's not the only one. Remember, there are several others we'll be talking about. But does that image speak to you?
The humanness allows me to converse. When I was growing up, my father and I would plant trees, fruit trees, in the dark. And I was 8 years old, and there would be times when it wasn't a father-son. It was just two people talking, giving and receiving. In differences of ages, my father being 40, me being 8. But that ability to talk and understand something from a very special person. I have somewhat experienced that with Bishop Kim. The few times I stand next to her, I know I'm in something special. But her smile and warmth allows me to talk to her. And I really appreciate that. And so when Borg talks about this Jesus that's got these human characteristics, I relate him in certain circumstances with interactions of like my father and with Bishop Kim.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yep.
Carla, here. Well, the question goes to the next implications for the life of the church, that Jesus was well, it's on page 37. No, the pre-Easter Jesus was not God. And so the spirit person is like, okay, the mystics in the Middle Ages were spirit people, but they weren't God. And I sort of thought that Jesus, a foundation of my faith is that Jesus is God. So this, I don't know how to put this together. I did go to sleep after I read this, but I didn't. So.
Okay, no, that's good. I think, and moving to this last section, this implications for the life of the church, he points out, as you just stated, that the image of Jesus suggests that the pre-Easter Jesus was not God. Now that's the vision of this chapter. He says that Jesus knew God, which is different than just believing strongly. That he knew God. Again, we're talking about this man, who lived in the first part of the first century. But he also argues that if you look at Jesus through the lens of a spirit person, or what he calls the cross-cultural view, while on the one hand it makes Jesus less unique, on the other hand it makes him more accessible and less remote. So unique and remote not being the same thing, but can be tied to one another. And he then says it sort of challenges our ideas about God, that God is no longer out there, kind of a deist God and separate from the world, but God through Jesus becomes an experiential reality. And so we can know God intimately and directly, just as Jesus did. So Jesus becomes a prototype, an exemplar, the firstborn of our faith, all of those kinds of things. And he sort of closes by saying that the pre-Easter Jesus becomes a powerful testimony to the reality and knowability of God. That it's not remote. Paul gives evidence of this too in his writings about being caught up in the Spirit and seeing things and realizing things. And you're right, Carla. The mystics have that same experience. And so he ends. He says, "This shifts how we think of Christian life. It's not about believing in Jesus or God, but being in relationship with the same Spirit that Jesus knew." And it's a different way of conceiving it. Not everybody's going to find that. That's not going to resonate for everyone. But for some, he would say this is a way back into understanding who or what God might be for the individual in his or her own life. So I'm going to stop talking and let there be a few last questions, comments. I understand what you're saying, Carla. It presents some challenges.
Yeah.
Gary, this is Jim Wolf. I really never felt I was going to be connected like that into the spiritual part of God. And then about 10 or 15 years ago, I started doing Faith Alive weekends. And what I found is they always had a prayer session or before the weekend. And I used to go to those prayer sessions and I'd say, God, I have no idea why I'm on this weekend. I don't know who you want me to touch. And I found when I did that, every weekend I did, there was an opportunity to touch somebody that I had no idea was going to occur. And it just, at those times, I just felt like I was really in connection with Jesus or God. And I've always wondered, if I can do it for a 3-day weekend, why can't I do it all the time? I can't answer that. All I can tell you is that's just what I experienced.
I was going to ask how many of us feel like we've had a spirit connection with God at what, you know.
Almost everyone.
Yeah. So I think that's where you start. Anyway.
But I think, you know, for mine, it was, you know, most unexpected and not at all how I thought it would be.
Yeah.
I find it, I distrust that spiritual experience of God because I've seen people who profess to have it and they're kind of bad for people.
I think Elaine's right that the litmus test is it has to be surprising and unexpected, because then it's not self-fulfilling, you know. Yeah, that makes it more meaningful, I think. Yeah.
Well, and I think the other thing is it draws you out of yourself rather than into yourself. It draws you into community or something. I don't know.
And I think it just happens, and you know, you think back on those times and you go, wow, what happened?
Exactly, Jim. It certainly guided me through times of crisis. But I just, you know, you stop for a half second and say, dear God, what now? Here I go. And go. And there's no conscious thought, it just happens.
And what everybody is expressing, and I'm going to end here just to be mindful of everybody's time, is that this is a different way of experiencing God than checking off the boxes in some kind of rule book.
Correct.
You know, and so, and Jesus shows us that, whereas he was conversing with folks, as far as we can tell from the Gospels, who were into checking off the boxes. You know, how do you eat without washing your hands? Oh, for crying out loud, that's not what's important. You know, it's not what goes in, it's what comes out. Don't you see it? No, we want to wash everything first. You know, and so he's showing a very different way of encountering God because of his relationship with that thing that is so much greater than all of us. And so he's modeling, I think, and Borg would not argue with us, he's modeling how we can be in relationship with God as well, giving us that. And in many respects, that would be a salvific act, to take us away from checking the boxes and into a really vital relationship.
And
So-
you know, I'm wondering if our image of God doesn't make this harder, because as I see it, if Jesus was that connected with God, it's not a far leap to say Jesus was God, because why does God have to have a boundary?
He or she does. I
There
don't
you
think
go.
there is a boundary. And I really do appreciate the idea of checking things off, because I have known many friends whose faith was based on let's make a deal. God, if you do this for me, then I will do that. And
Yep.
or I will do that if you do this for me. And that isn't the way it works. I've been told no. You know? And so it's not, for me, it's not a matter of separating out the man Jesus. And I know the early church had real discussions over this.
Yep.
Because there were the group that wanted him to be a man, and then after the resurrection, he became God. But I have him as God even in his life. So I don't have a problem with that.
Right.
Yeah, it's not let's make a deal.
Well, we'll keep pondering all these things in our hearts, like Mary.
Right.
Let my heart, Mary, be thy sanctuary. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Keep
Bye.
bringing those questions.
Thank you.
Bye. Everybody have a good week.
Bye-bye. Have a good week.
Bye.
Bye.